Thank you very much, Sean. And it is just terrific to be here. David, I want to say thank you to you, and I'll add that the air here in the building that holds the charters of freedom is just as good as the air at Montpelier. So this is the right place. And by the way, we're not all Michael Quinn. It's my pleasure to introduce the panelists with me. We've asked some very distinguished individuals to discuss these survey results and their meaning. I'm pleased to welcome Professor Michael Meyerson of the University of Baltimore School of Law, Ms. Cokie Roberts, who's a noted commentator for ABC and for NPR, and Mr. Charles Quigley, who's the executive director of the Center for Civic Education, which is really the nation's leading educational advocate and provider of educational materials for civics. It's an incredible organization. By the way, let me add at the outset that we've all agreed ahead of time that we will talk to each other using our first names. So please don't think I'm disrespectful, but we want this to be a conversation. I'm very deeply grateful to the Claude Charitable Foundation for its support of the survey and of this lecture. This is now the 4th year of the lecture, and each year we focused it on examining the state of the Constitution. This year, of course, we're looking at what does the American people know of the Constitution. And I'd like to recognize the members of the board of the Claude Moore Foundation who are here with us tonight. It's Mr. Jesse Wilson. Could I ask you just to raise your hands? Jesse Wilson, Mr. Peter Arnston, and Mr. Lee Middleditch. If we can thank you all. For your civic mindedness. And I'm pleased also that we're joined by so many members of the board of directors of the Montpelier Foundation, the steward of James Madison's Montpelier. I won't name you, but please identify yourselves to those around you. And I'm delighted that so many friends and supporters of Montpelier have come from Charlottesville and Orange to be with us tonight. What a pleasure to be with you as we enjoy this great privilege of being at the National Archives. Now, as David explained, Constitution Day is September 17th. We've just passed the 223rd anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. I'll add that we observe Constitution Day at James Madison's Montpelier in Orange, Virginia, just as they do here at the National Archives. And I'll also add that learning about the Constitution need not be restricted to Constitution Day, nor need visiting the archives, or Montpelier for that matter, which is open year-round. That's the commercial plug. Now, as Professor Kidd pointed out, the survey demographics are really very reliable. And so we can take this as a pretty accurate measure of how Americans think about the Constitution. And by the way, we want to invite you all to see how your knowledge of the Constitution measures up. So if you want to take the same survey and find out how you did, go to Montpelier's website, which is montpelier.org. It's on your program, and see how you do. Okay. I thought we'd start tonight by looking at the general information gathered in the survey. And as Sean said, for those in our audience, if you open your program, you'll see it has charts that summarize just a few of the findings of the survey. Now, after we cover that, we're going to get into some patterns in the survey that really aren't apparent to you just from the program. We're able to do a very detailed analysis of what people said, but we will talk about what that means and what it might mean for America today. And then finally, we're going to open the session for questions from you in the audience. So please, as the discussion goes forward, if you've got a question, jot it down. You'll have a chance to ask before we wrap up this evening. Now, I'd like to start with one of the most basic issues. Do Americans read the Constitution? You do have that graph in your program, and you'll see that only slightly more than 1/4 of those surveyed claim to have read the entire text of the Constitution. Chuck, as the head of the Center for Civic Education, I'll ask you, should Americans read the Constitution? Is it really important?
Yes.
I think.
But more than read it, they should study it, they should discuss it, because just it's not exactly
readable.
Readable, you know. You talk about corruption of blood and various things like that. So I think I mean, first they should take courses in it, they should discuss it, they should learn to understand what its most fundamental principles. And they obviously don't, unfortunately. And there's a tremendous shortcoming in our schools, that our schools are just not teaching the Constitution. We have another study that shows only about 12% of people feel that they have had an adequate education in civic education.
Now, why is it you say that just reading it isn't enough? I mean, if it's such an important charter.
Well, I think you need to read it, reflect upon it, discuss it with other people to get an really to understand it, and particularly discuss it with people who know something about it, with experts. You need the average person will read it, then you do a comprehension survey. I would bet after having just read it, they're still not going to really understand it thoroughly.
Michael, you teach, I'm sure you teach the Constitution in your law classes. I mean, how do you communicate what it means? I hope you do.
I think the answer to the question about why isn't reading it enough, it's the essential first step. But the Constitution was written in a historical time, in a historical context. So you need to understand the beginning, but much more important is that it's been interpreted and changed over the 200-odd years. And so you need to know not just where it began and why it began, but what's happened to it, and then fundamentally, how to think about it. The Constitution doesn't tell us how to read it. In fact, many of the discussions you hear on the Supreme Court are about how should we interpret it, and the Constitution, sadly, doesn't answer that question.
Well, I've also always felt like the Constitution is like looking at the blueprints for a house. It may tell you, where to put the walls, but it doesn't tell you why the owner wanted the living room of such and such a size. And you really need to get to some of the ideas behind it. And it's interesting because the next question we ask is, how many Americans feel they understand it? Now, a little baffling here is that a larger portion, nearly 1/3, and that's larger than those who've read it, this may be the American way, say they have a good understanding of the Constitution. Cokie, you are...
I don't find that baffling at all. I'm still working on, it being disrespectful to call me by my first name, because I've been called so many worse things. The truth is that you can understand the Constitution without having thoroughly read it. You've been taught in school about the separation of powers, and with any luck, and you've gotten some basic sense about the consent of the governed, and all of that, and reading the document itself. I mean, I think it's wonderful when people do it, and of course, I knew Bobby Bird very well and have my little pocket, versions, many of them. But the truth is, it's arcane language, and it also, even if you get used to the language, it has footnotes. This was changed. This isn't this way anymore. All of that. So I think you can have an understanding without having, done an exegesis of the document itself. But what I found so interesting here is the fact that people do find it relevant today. I think of those men, and I'm very fond of the Rotunda here. I'm on the board of this institution, the Archives, and I always say that the Rotunda at the National Archives is really our national church. That it's hushed and quiet, and there are these documents that we all can come together on, despite our differences on other things. And for me, as a good Catholic girl, I always feel like, the Declaration of Independence is St. Joseph's altar, and the Constitution is the main altar, and the Bill of Rights is Our Lady's altar. And I love the fact that Our Lady is there for the Bill of Rights. But the fact is, the men up in the murals above, in their funny knee breeches and powdered wigs, I think would be amazed that we are still reverencing those documents that they wrote then, and that they are still so relevant and important to us 223 years later.
Well, Michael, Cokie, that's a terrific perspective. Michael, from the legal analysis point of view, do you think would you say the Constitution is still working? Are we right to continue to reverence it?
I think it's not coincidental. I can't do the biblical analysis, but to have the Constitution in the center, it's interesting because you celebrate July 4th. You did not need any action to make the July 4th holiday important, fireworks, independence, freedom.
Right.
But if you go upstairs, it's the Constitution that's the center. And I think on a very deep level, people really do treat it like something that holds us together. It's a national glue. We may disagree on what it means, but there is a strong sense that it really matters, and we want to preserve the Constitution however we may think it is.
And I think that's so fundamentally important in these divided times that we're in. And we can talk about some of the divisions from the survey, which I would like to do.
Yeah.
But the fact is that we really have no nationhood other than those documents that are in that rotunda. You know, we don't have a common ethnicity or a common religion or a common history, even though we have our little tiny American history. Many of us come from other places that have much longer histories. We don't even have, in many places, a common language. It's those documents that bind us together as a nation and the institutions those documents created. And I think reverencing those documents and those institutions, as much as we may sometimes hate them, is exactly the right thing to do as Americans.
Well, you've made the point that most of us understand a lot of the ideas of the Constitution without reading it, and I think that's true. In fact, our survey says that an overwhelming proportion say the Constitution still works, and they think it affects them on the day-to-day basis. But Chuck, you're our educator here. Is it enough just to intuitively know some of these principles? Is that all it takes?
Well, I don't think a lot of people really understand the ideas, to tell you the truth. We did a survey of high school government teachers with 50 central concepts, separation of powers, checks and balances, and so forth, and found that about 50% of the high school government teachers couldn't define these concepts. And one of the problems
Government teachers.
Government
teachers.
teachers. Now,
not
one of the
students.
problems is their degrees are not in political science, constitutional law. They're teaching out of subject. So I think, as a matter of fact, these people, they're talking about rule of law. I'd like to ask them what rule of law means to them. I think they would not come out with a thorough understanding of what a rule of law is, what judicial review, the incorporation doctrine, and things like that. There's just an incredible widespread ignorance, really. I mean, it's nice that they say they've read it and they understand it. I think they feel that they should, which is wonderful. You know, maybe that'll make them guilty enough to try and go find out something about it.
Well, it's interesting because the survey does show that some of the basic concepts, rule of law, which you mentioned, separation of church and state, separation of powers, people think they get them. Whether they really do or not is another matter. But there's another basic concept of our Constitution, popular sovereignty. And it's interesting, only about half in the survey get that.
They haven't read and understood the preamble, we the people. You know, they haven't looked at understood the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, you know, why governments are instituted on men and so forth, and where they derive their powers.
But when you talk about separation of powers, people forget. And when I did constitutional law when I was a student, I realized we did the entire constitutional law class and never talked about voting. It was like you have all this power divided, and they never got to the point that the people have the first and last word. And I think it's even part of our educational system that we underestimate the role of popular sovereignty.
I agree with that. I mean, people, you know, as a journalist who covers elections, I have the number. If I had $1 for everybody who told me why they didn't vote, I'd be a very rich woman. And often it's because they feel it doesn't matter. You know, it doesn't make any difference who I elect. Their lives are vastly affected by it, but it doesn't seem to, you know, get through. But one of the things that, you know, again, as a journalist, when you look at data, normally what we look at in polling data is either trends, which is not possible in this survey because it's one of a kind, or gaps. and I do find the gaps quite fascinating. And we find gaps along questions of party, of age, and of race, but they're not all the same. They go way up and down, where for instance, Republicans by 3/4 say that the Constitution affects them a lot on a day-to-day basis. Now, I don't know what that means. Whereas Democrats and independents, shy of 2/3, that's a 13-point gap. In polling, that's a great big number. But so then you say, well, all right, well, there must be something going on about Republicans in the Constitution. But then when you break it out by age, it's young people that have that huge gap. And they're the ones who say the Constitution affects them on a day-to-day basis. And others, older than 18 to 24, don't say that. And that's just a complete disconnect between who's Republican and who's young. And so, you feel like going to each one of these people and calling them up and saying, what did you mean? Because it is interesting and confusing data to me.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that Republican-Democrat split, and we'll come back to the age one. I found that is interesting because again and again we hear people say that our political system is utterly polarized. Does this indicate that it is the voters driving the politicians into opposite corners, or is it the politicians running to those opposite corners?
It's a combination, and you can't leave the media out of that equation either. The fact is that the voters claim that they want politicians who get along and get something done. Why can't we all just get along? But the fact is that they elect people who don't get along well at all. And I mean, in my childhood, the saying used to be, you can disagree without being disagreeable. Now they agree and they're disagreeable. And so, but you look at this data, 2/3 of Republicans and independents disagree that the American Constitution limits government's powers. Now, what that's about is that they think government power should be more limited. So they think the Constitution is flawed there. Mm-hmm. Whereas Democrats, 45% agree. That's a 20-point gap. Mm-hmm. Now, that's clearly a polarization. And it's interesting about the independents, by the way. They're sometimes with the Republicans and sometimes with the Democrats here. Which is, I guess, why they're independents. But so clearly what you've got, this survey being taken at the moment that it was taken, which is always important in terms of survey data, was at a time when the Constitution is being argued about, whether understood or not, with a lot of people saying it should be limiting the power of government more because they're feeling that government's doing too much. And so they're blaming the Constitution for what's happening in the political world that they are unhappy about.
Well, it may be. Is that where the blame belongs, though?
Not when it comes to limiting the powers of government. I mean, for years and years and years, most people have felt that the Constitution goes way too far. I don't agree with this view in limiting the power of government, because you not only have this very cumbersome separation of powers, no parliamentary system can, I mean, explain, when you live abroad and cover politics abroad and try to explain the American system to people, they're just flabbergasted, because why wouldn't you have a system where the prime minister and the parliament agree and things get done, lickety split? When you explain the separation of powers, which we have for most of the last half century extended to a separation of politics with different parties operating different branches, it is very limited government indeed.
Yeah. Well, we also asked about federalism, our system of having both a state and a national government, and we found that Americans understand that at the broadest authority, the money supply, treaties with other nations, that clearly is a federal responsibility. But otherwise, they can't find the split. what have you seen on this, Chuck, in terms
Well,
of your...
just talk to any member of Congress or congressional staff person and ask them what kind of inquiries they get from their constituents. I have a beauty from Morris Udall. Thank you for your kind letter of December 4th. I do, however, have a further question. The big one. So far, all of Congress has evaded it. How do I obtain a divorce?
Or murder.
If I don't receive some satisfaction by February, I fully intend to contact a reporter, maybe, and be on my way to Washington, D.C. Sir, I have had more than enough. I don't intend to let this matter go any longer than February.
Well, Chuck,
But, I mean, there are a zillion anecdotes like that, you know.
yeah. But the idea of federalism, federal and state, was very important to our founders. As the world...
It's important and it's complicated, and it's not that easy to understand. You know, there are overlapping authorities and responsibilities and so forth. But people can become literate, at least, and know, you know, where to go to find the information. You know, where do you get a divorce, or, you know, what do you do about a dog catcher or something like that? You don't go to your member of Congress. I mean, it's just a basic civic literacy that most people don't have.
But it's interesting, the issue on which they got it wrong, to some degree in this survey, was immigration. And that's because it's a hot political issue at the moment. And there's, you know, there's states who are trying to take control of the immigration laws in the absence, they would say, of federal action. And so people are feeling like when they say, I mean, what you never can get at in these surveys is sometimes people are answering what they think should be the case. And right now, some people are feeling that states should be controlling immigration because the federal government isn't.
See, if you have a certain generation, the word state, the phrase states' rights was used by the bad guys. It was used to justify segregation. It was used to say federal government, Brown versus education is wrong. You should not be involved in integration. So of a certain generation, states' rights was evil. But then, if you look at the course of history, the states have been the good guys as often as the bad guys. If you're liberal, you might like states' rights on gay marriage more than federal. And so it's always a matter of dividing power, and the fact that it's not a clean cut makes it incredibly difficult to talk about. But if you read James Madison, you realize it wasn't supposed to be a clean cut. He wrote that the people should be able to put their trust where they think it belongs. It's supposed to be flexible. And the trouble, going back to your political, you know, of today, is that people don't want things to be flexible. They want it to be their way. But if you read history and you look at the course of American politics and federalism, it has shifted. It was supposed to shift. And on the whole, it's shifted pretty well.
But the states, of course, in the time of the writing of the Constitution were so powerful, and people referred to my country. And when they talked about my country, they meant Maryland. And so that is, you know, something that you really, and in fact, the we the people, that wonderful phrase that we all love so much, was originally written as we the folks of, you know, of Rhode Island, North Carolina, South Carolina. And Governor Morris pulled it together with a good editing pen and fixed it into these glorious words. But the states were terribly, terribly important.
And remember something, we had a civil war.
Right.
That in the way we think about the United States is it went from being a plural to being a singular phrase. The United States is free. In the old days, the United States are free. So when you talk about the Constitution and you look at that document, remember that it took a civil war to make we the people include a whole lot more. It took the 19th Amendment to make it include even more. That we have a document that should be revered but had to change because it was inadequate in fundamental ways.
We're still trying to perfect our union.
I think that's a very good point, you know, to form a more perfect union. And in fact, you know, from our standpoint today, there are many things about the Constitution that just seem absolutely unbelievable, the most obvious of which is that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a human being. But the Constitution, and yet if you look at the Constitution, there have been remarkably few amendments. Michael, you probably know,
27.
27.
And that's a good thing.
Well, I have two more points I want to cover on this survey. We also tried to get a sense of American civic mindedness. Now, this again is asking people to describe themselves to us, and people, you know, That has interesting ramifications. We focused on whether they vote, their reasons for voting, and even things such as what are the marks of good citizenship, like paying taxes. Michael, did you see any trends here that you thought were noteworthy?
The most frightening trend I found was that above the age of 25, people are voting always, in answer to the question, at clips of 55, 60, 75%. Between the ages of 18 and 24, they're voting at 37%. Only 1/3 of people of that age group, of our future, is voting all the time. And I find that to be absolutely depressing. I also found that it was probably connected to the fact that many of them also don't think the Constitution works. They don't think separation of powers is important. There's almost a separation from what I think the rest of the country is seeing, and I think the young people have to be sort of brought in to this grand picture.
The two groups of people who said we needed a new Constitution were young people and African Americans. And that I found very interesting. Now, you know, you can make a case that even though at the beginning the Constitution was horrendous to African Americans, that it is through the constitutional system and the courts and then, of course, then finally the Congress, that the laws have been changed in a way that you know, has finally worked. But young people, I'm not sure how much of that is knowledge and how much of that is just, well, anything that's 200 years old has got to be bad. I mean, anything that's 40.
Well, Chuck, you work a lot with young people in your programs. That is your mission, your focus, the high school government classes and teachers.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that people that have effective classes in civics and government vote. They register to vote 85%, something like that, compared to 30% of regular high school students.
So a good teacher, a good classroom
good teacher,
experience,
good
a good
class,
education.
they become politically active, politically engaged. They develop a greater understanding of the Constitution, fundamental principles, develop greater political tolerance, so forth. So, you know, that's the remedy is education.
So do you think that what we're seeing here is a recent phenomenon, or is this a phenomenon that we might have seen if we'd done the survey 30 years ago?
As far as young people voting?
Yes.
No, I don't have the data on that.
I actually do. We had the 18-year-old vote came in 1972. That was the first year. That was the sort of high. That was the peak, and it's essentially gone down since then. There was, you know, of course, in 2008, a lot of discussion about the youth vote and the participation, and it was slightly up in 1992. In 2008, with the discussion about the youth vote, in fact, young people did turn out in greater numbers than they ever had before, but everybody turned out in greater numbers, so their percentages were not up. If you take away the 18-year-olds and go to the 21-year-old vote, that was you had better participation, and one of the things that we learned is that people tend to vote as they have a stake. That, you know, they move into a house, their kids are in school, they're paying taxes, they better vote, or else they can't complain. But the
of course, our founders believed in that principle to the point that you actually had to be a landowner.
Property, absolutely.
Your stake had to be real property to vote.
Right.
Michael, do you think we should revive that?
I'll get back. No. One of the questions is how you make this an inclusive system. And I think what worries me about what we've just heard is that every election matters. And just like the Constitution matters, and if you're a young person, and whether you want to watch a violent video game or get birth control, or have your Christian newspaper funded by your public university, the Constitution matters, and elections matter. And the fact that people think that a particular election matter, I really worry about, because decisions get made both judicially and legislatively that will affect them all the time, and if they don't know it, it will be not in their best interests.
Well, I also noticed, by the way, on this topic of...
I keep telling them, you know, old people have tremendous power because they vote. People think it's all about money. It's not all about money. Old people are tight. We don't, you know, we don't give money, but they vote, and vote on issues that they consider important to them. And I keep saying, in college towns, guys, you know, you could elect the entire, you know, mayor and city council. Of course, then you'd have to do something. But they don't get that they could work around issues that matter to them.
You know, you also mentioned the disparity between not just young people, but African Americans. A higher percentage of them are willing to say it's time for a new constitution. As I mentioned before, in the original Constitution, you could not have a worse scenario with African Americans enslaved, counted as 3/5 of a person. That has changed. With an African American as president, have we finally achieved equal justice?
Well,
Mike?
Oh,
Gonna ask
you
you,
got
Michael.
lucky.
no, I mean,
No, I
no
mean,
is my
no,
answer.
no,
You'll get your
it's-
turn, Cokie.
It's not equal justice. It's a process.
Right.
And one of the things about the Constitution is that it's not enough. So in fact, they end slavery, they guarantee equality in the 1860s, and yet things go from bad to worse, actually, with Jim Crow laws, with segregation. And so in fact, to undo, it's not 200 years of slavery, it's really 400 years of real abuse, is going to take a long time. And I think that there are fundamental, deep-seated issues about how the Constitution is designed to deal not just with the immediate, as in everyone should vote, but the much longer-term issue of how do you deal with the fact that we start off with what I guess would now be called structural inequality. And if you want to argue, the Constitution was not made to think about that issue.
Well, that's a very good point. The opposing view might be that the Constitution has embedded in it the ability for improvement.
No question.
And look how far we've come. How do young people view that aspect of the Constitution, Chuck? How do you deal with that in your programs, your educational programs?
You're talking about the extension of rights and liberties?
The extension of rights and liberty, the fact that the Constitution originally had this structural injustice, this racial bias
Well,
in
you
it.
tell the truth. You look at history. Look at the changes, and actually, there's been remarkable progress, if you look. There's still a tremendous amount that needs to be done. As a matter of fact, in my lifetime, I can remember my mother's from a small town in Alabama, where they lynched black people,
Yeah.
and they were proud of it. Now there's a mayor of the town is black, There are tremendous changes over the last 40, 50, 60 years, but there's still a tremendous amount that needs to be done. And young people are idealistic enough, I believe, if they really look at what the values and principles that this nation was founded upon, not that it lived up to early on and so forth, but you can encourage that idealism and make them feel particularly active and politically efficacious, which they do once they know something about the system and how to work it, that they will try to do something to take us to the next step further, which might be passing of an equal rights amendment.
Well,
I wouldn't hold my breath.
audience participation. Well, on that topic, let me ask you, what will be the next amendment to the Constitution? Cokie, would you like to jump into that one?
Well, I hope there isn't one. My basic view about amendments to the Constitution is that as long as they're expanding rights, they're great, and if they are contracting rights, that I'd just soon not see them. Prohibition, bad amendment to the Constitution.
Well, a number of states have recently passed constitutional amendments that define marriage as between a man and a woman.
Well, I don't think that will get 3/4 of the states in the Congress. I just, and in fact, all of the trend is in the opposite direction, quite dramatically in the opposite direction. I've never seen an issue where public opinion has changed as fast as it has on that issue. It's quite remarkable. But the last amendment was the last one, basically back to the 12th Amendment? Yes. So it was saying a member of Congress can't raise his salary or her salary. That was in the original Bill of Rights, and it finally got ratified in 1990-something, I think.
So James Madison got
James
11
Madison.
of the amendments.
I'd actually love to tell you a little story about James Madison and the Bill of Rights, because I think it's illustrative about politics today. We tend to think of these men who wrote these documents as these bronze and marble figures, these deities. And some of you probably know that I've written a couple of books about the women of the founding era and their letters to each other and the men's letters to them. I think it's fair to say that the women did not see the men as deities. They saw them as very flesh and blood men. And the story of the Bill of Rights is such a political story. I mean, it's obviously a lot more complicated, and all through the ratification process, it kept coming up and all of that. But at the end, what happened was that James Madison, Patrick Henry was the governor of Virginia, and he was an anti-federalist. And he had drawn, everybody says, oh, these redistricting is terrible, what's going on, it's also political. He had drawn district, James Madison's district, it looked like a hand. And every finger had anti-federalist in it, and the little gaps had federalist, and they were somebody else's district. And they've got to set up a whole military system. I mean, there's a lot to do. And Madison keeps saying, Bill of Rights, Bill of Rights. And they keep saying, come on, we've just gone through this whole ratification process. We can't do that. He says, it's a campaign promise. I can't break it. So that's how we got a Bill of Rights. So don't feel so bad about politics.
Well, while we're on the subject of James Madison, we couldn't resist asking what Americans know about James Madison. I am almost embarrassed to read these results to you. Only about 5% say they have studied Madison in detail. I will say almost everyone knows of him as U.S. President. Most know he was important in organizing the Constitutional Convention and was an advocate of religious freedom. But only about a third are certain he should be called the father of the Constitution. So panelists, I'll start with you, Mike. Is it important to know about our founders and what they did? I mean, is this just studying old men in funny clothes?
Well, I think 1/3 also declared that he was a Revolutionary War hero. And his only injury actually occurred during one of those election debates where he got frostbite on his nose. And he said, that's my war injury. But I think it's important because if you want to understand the context, well, there are a couple of things going on. First of all, you have to understand why they're creating a constitution. Going back to the Bill of Rights story, there's something very subtle about that story. They passed a constitution without it. And they still thought they were guaranteeing freedom. How did that happen? They just forget? And the answer is they knew something. It was just what Madison called a parchment barrier, these freedoms like religion and speech, unless you had the right structure. All that time in Philadelphia was spent on planning a structure, that separation of powers that maybe other countries can laugh at, and we muddle through, but I kind of like gridlock.
Oh, me too.
It was the original plan. One of the Madison's lines, and this is why I think you study him, because they're things that we don't see often combined. They're wise and they're good people. They're really educated, and if you read their private letters, not the ones about the laundry, but the ones, not the ones, but the ones that talk like Jefferson and Madison are writing to each other back and forth.
Yeah, but they knew they'd be published. Those are pompous letters.
You had a few written in code. And the ones that are written in code seem to reveal a certain sense of they want to do the right thing. And I get the feeling that if you look at Madison, he's writing that whoever has power is liable to abuse it. And I think that if you look at the Constitution, it was designed to limit power because no one should be trusted. Right. And that's, I think young people could like that lesson. But I think the bottom line is when you look at the Constitution, you look at the writings of Madison and others, I think you understand why they put so much effort into this document.
Okay, so if one of the messages from studying the creation of the Constitution is no one should be trusted, how does that shape our view of government itself?
You have a rule of law. That's what, that's what's trustworthy. And putting the structure in place was terribly important. And think how hard that was. I mean, not only have we just fought a war against a monarch, but these states, the glue of coming together against the common enemy had completely dried up. And these states felt very, very strongly that they were the country. And so to put that structure in place that became a trustworthy structure was incredibly hard. And thank God the press wasn't allowed in.
Chuck, what were some of the circumstances that really motivated the founders to overcome such daunting odds?
I want to go back to your question, should people know something about Madison and Hamilton and so forth? And I think definitely we should be teaching about them. So it makes them come alive. It makes them understand, a deeper understanding, understand the warts and all, understand what their wives thought about them and so forth. But I think it just gives you a rich background that helps you. It gives you a framework for understanding politics and government at that time and also for today. So,
Do you find that the stories of people like Madison, that they also help inform young people about what an individual can do?
oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Because I often think that, you know, we can complain about countries going to the dogs, you know, everything's a mess, political gridlock, but these problems are nothing compared to what our nation was facing, the states were facing in the founding era.
But I think you also get stories, like your books, about wasted talent. You know, the Abigail Adams of the world, people who should be running things. And I think to me, the ability to tell people that, look, just because you have talent isn't enough, that you have to use it, and you have to create a system that allows you to use it. And I think the history, if you look at a full history, you realize how much wasted, I mean, we had some wonderful people. We had a lot of wasted potential there as well.
But I also, one of the reasons, I mean, I love writing about the women just because they themselves are so much fun, but the fact is, I think their perspective on the men is very useful because it makes them human. They're not gods. And if they're gods, you know, then nobody can emulate them. And if they're guys, then, you know, then there's somebody that you can relate to and say, well, I could do that. I could work that hard and work for my country that way.
I want to return to a point that Michael made about the sense of don't trust anyone. Because one theme I see in modern politics is the government is the problem. And if you combine that with this ethic of don't trust anyone, is government the problem? How would the founders have viewed that?
No, I think the problem is the people, you know, who don't understand government, who have such a negative attitude about government, don't understand the purpose of government, don't understand that it's their government, that, you know, the whole idea of popular sovereignty, that the government is answerable to them and so forth. It's shocking that half the people in the United States don't understand that fundamental principle.
But James Madison...
So I don't think government's the problem. Let me just add, I think people don't really reflect enough about what government can do and what it should be doing. What are the purposes of government? Look at the preamble to the Constitution and look, you know, domestic tranquility, general welfare, and so forth. People don't reflect upon that and what government, I'll coin I'll flip around Kennedy's thing, I think people should think not about what they can do for government, but think more reflectively about what they want their government to do for them. It's their government, it's their servant. And do you want government, do you want private sector to handle health care, or do you want the government to handle health care, so forth. Immigration, you want the private sector to deal with pure food and drugs? Not me, you know.
But the founders were very skeptical of government, and
Too
that's why these documents are so.
Then why did they go to such effort to create a government?
Because they realized something else, and this is Madison's #1, his unique insight, which was that if anyone who has power can abuse it, in a democracy, it's the people who have power. The majority can abuse its own power. Right. So you may not trust the government, but guess what? Who else is there? In other words, if anybody with power can abuse it, you need to create a system that is so complicated, that has so many checks and balances, that you can limit everybody's worst instincts. As he said, you know, people aren't angels, and that includes the voters. So we created a system, including judicial review, power for the states, dividing the House and Senate. All of those were designed simply because no one should be trusted alone with power. But at the same time, there was also an optimism. There was also a sense that at the same time, you know, democracy is needed because people aren't that good. Democracy only works because there is virtue in people. And this is the sort of paradox that Madison worked into the Constitution.
And they worked very hard on creating virtuous citizens. This was actually quite wonderful for women because it sort of looked around and said, if we're going to keep this republic, we better raise some virtuous citizens. Oh, who's going to raise them? I suppose their mothers. And so after the Revolution, a lot of female academies were started for the purpose of educating women to educate the men who would become the virtuous citizens.
But I think Madison would have said you cannot rely on virtue alone. You need it, and I think it was almost biblical in the way he recognized that the spark of justice is in all of us, but so is that potential for depravity. And that was his word. If you go back to the preamble, which you referred to, Chuck, it isn't just to keep evil people in check. There's also some positive things there, to form a more perfect union, to achieve liberty, justice. There was another side they saw of government as well. There was another side of the government they saw as well, in that they saw liberty. What was the role they saw of government in protecting liberty and freedom?
Well, I believe, look at, well, among one thing, Congress shall make no law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Government should not interfere, should protect, but nevertheless, I think take positive steps in protecting the rights of individuals. That's why they added the Bill of Rights and so forth. So, and by the way, that's one thing that's not in your survey, is the function of government in protecting rights. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men and so forth. The common good is there, so we have this tension between the protection of individual rights and the common good, which is something that we all also need to reflect upon. And when does one subordinate your particular rights, your economic rights, or whatever, in favor of the common good? These are very important questions that are not adequately discussed, often not discussed in our schools, not discussed adequately in public discourse. In fact, Lee Hamilton the other day made a big pitch about Congress not really paying attention to the common good, too much involved in self-interest and so forth. It's a big problem.
I think without question what Madison would have said is be watchful of your government, but I think he also would have recognized that government is really how we solve problems and set the vision for the future.
Trust but verify.
Well, on that point, our survey also shows that most people think that their elected representatives in Washington are pretty accountable to them. And yet other parts of the survey say that they don't feel the actions of government are really in keeping with its principles. So, Michael, we've got a disconnect, right?
Well, I think one of the things is you vote for one member of the House, you don't vote for most of the others. And so, in other words, and this goes back to that issue we talked about the idea of how do you have a union of people who are very, very different. So you may like one particular legislator, but when you look at the body of them, a lot of them you don't like, and then as Cokie was saying, when you watch them together and they're all misbehaving, it's hard to like any of them.
Well,
This is another place where there's a big gap in a partisan way, though.
Okay.
Republicans, 63% of Republicans say elected officials are accountable, and only 50% of Democrats. That's a 13-point gap. That's a great big gap in polling, and I find that one particularly interesting when you have a government at the moment in Washington that is a majority Democratic government and a Democrat in the White House. So I'm not sure what that one's about, but it is a very noticeable gap.
There are other issues here too, which we didn't get into our survey. It isn't always, if you don't feel that government is producing the results in keeping with its principles, you can question the charter, the Constitution. You can question the elected officials. You can also question the bureaucracy. There are probably other things we should be asking. You
want to remember that when the Constitution is written, no one understood what a bureaucracy was. In Alexander Hamilton's Treasury Department, there were like 7 people. And it's inconceivable how, there are several things that the framers didn't see coming. One was bureaucracy, another was political parties, and the third was corporations.
Well, but they had to know political parties were coming because they were already dividing into them pretty quickly.
I think like John Adams, though,
I mean,
they thought
the
that
Federalists, Anti-Federalists were right there at the beginning.
I don't think they expected permanent parties, though. I think they thought they'd be more fluid over the time than to have a Democrat and Republican. And to settle into the two-party system we have, the Constitution just envisioned a much more fluid electoral college, I believe.
Well, is it naive then to say that they really expected our elected representatives to go to Congress and sit down and do their best to solve problems without any party interest?
Well, that's not what happened in the first Congress, so it's not like, and look, again, I don't think politician is a dirty word, I'd be an ingrate if I did, but I think that it's important to recognize these men were politicians. And that's why I told the Madison story about the Bill of Rights. They were doing things that might have been for the common good in that case, but they were also doing it for their political self-interest. And that is not, it would be insane to think that they were not doing that.
So do you think our political system as it stands now is working?
Yes, absolutely.
As messy as it is?
Absolutely, it was meant to be messy.
Michael, what's your vote?
It was designed. Nothing is more frightening than a government that's efficient. You don't want.
Messiness was written into the charter. That's what it absolutely dictates, messiness.
Okay.
I disagree. I don't think it's working as well as it should be working. One thing, I'd like to get rid of the filibuster and have a more engaged populace, a more intelligently engaged populace, citizenry.
Well,
We have, a filibuster in the early Congresses. There was a filibuster in the House of Representatives as well as the Senate. And in a debate, I think it was over the Embargo Act, one member of the House threw a great big brass spittoon, and it shocked everyone and stopped the conversation for a minute, and they declared the filibuster over. Now think what must have come out of that spittoon. I mean, it's really unwise to put these people on too high a pedestal.
Well, on the topic of filibusters, one of the bigger issues the founders debated at the Constitutional Convention was actually was representation in the House and in the Senate. The debate resolved into that the big states really wanted representation to be based on population. And the small states wanted the states represented. We ended up with both. If we were to revise the Constitution today, Michael, would this still be a big issue?
Well, there are two. It would be a very large issue for a lot of reasons. But one of the things to think about, about when you study the Constitution, is you realize that compromise isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, quite the contrary.
Today, in politics, they call the great compromise the great sellout, and Gouverneur Morris the worst person in the world, because anyone who didn't hold to a party line is going to be considered just unworthy. But I think the Constitution worked because it was designed as a compromise, because people understood they couldn't get everything. And so while it's a peculiar system, I think it's worked because it was a legitimate compromise of competing principles.
But I've also heard many observers say that the Senate is the least democratic institution of our government.
But it's a vestige of, if you want to go back to federalism. The idea is, how do you protect states as sources of power? James Madison said, why do we have two levels of government? In Maryland, you have a state constitution, a U.S. Constitution. Why? You want two levels of protection. The theory is, ironically, the more governments there are, the safer you are, because the harder it is for anyone to take over.
And that tyranny of the majority, I mean, that was a great genius of these guys, is that they understood that, yes, they were ready to, vest power in the people, but they didn't want the majority of the people being able to run rampant over everyone else. And that's what the Senate is there for, and it does it haltingly and messily and all of that, and often amusingly, but that is what that is there to do, is to stop the tyranny of the majority.
But it also reminds us about states. In fact, if you think about it, other than the presidential primaries, when you think about this Delaware Senate, it's a Delaware. It's thinking about what the state means, and I think it's a very important way to preserve that element of federalism, despite anything else.
Mm-hmm.